Welcome to Tuesdays for Nurture. This is a webinar series hosted by the United Church of Christ and the Justice and Local Church Ministries, where we focus on education for the people of God. Our work together includes topics like faith-filled politics to interviews of key leaders to the impacts of current realities on the life of the church. And all of that and more will be featured. And each webinar includes opportunities for what you can do to change the church and the world towards the world God has called us into. I'm your host, Reverend Dr. Chris Davies, and I am so excited about what we are doing together today because we are talking about the power of boundaries. And as a pastor, as a woman, as a queer person, I know that my boundaries have been life-saving for me in terms of how to move within this world. So I am here alongside two incredible people to have this conversation. And the first is Reverend Barber, who works with the MESA team in terms of clergy boundaries and accountability. Welcome, Tara.
Thank you, Chris. It's so great to be here with you all. And yes, boundaries have been a passion for mine for years and years. I was formed under the Reverend Dr. Marie Fortune's wing with clergy boundaries and really the flip side, right? What happens when we don't keep those boundaries? And it's been a conversation that I've been engaged in for, I think, going on 20 years now. So it's great to be here with you and with Eleta.
And the brilliant leader from Liberation UCC in Seattle, Eleta K Wright, joining us to talk from the lens of her work in social work and how those boundaries have helped alongside her clients, family, friends, and beyond. Welcome, Eleta.
Thank you, Chris. It's good to be here. And thank you, Tara, for inviting me. Yes, boundaries. I am at my work in some ways seen as one of the go-to people around boundaries as far as between clients, the challenges of people who want to be close. And I'm not your friend, I am your case manager, to family. It's like, this is my downtime. So I take boundaries pretty seriously.
I'm so glad to be here with each of you. And I thought the first question that we might start off with is, you know, the whole world has shifted in the last several months. The unraveling has begun of those things that have kept power as it has been for a long time. And I'm curious, you know, in terms of COVID, in terms of the uprisings and everything that's happening in the world, what is a boundary that you have held for yourself that has enabled you to be stable, you know, centered and present alongside people in this time? Eleta, let's start with you.
I would say it's literally the boundary around working in this time. I fall into a couple of the categories, and before my work started paying attention to it, I was paying attention to it and actually feel like I supported us in moving to taking it on seriously enough for my level. And I maintained that boundary very strictly. I will not go in spaces without all the precautions. And literally my space at work, when I'm coming in, because I take it so seriously, they make sure nobody else is in there when I come in, and that they don't come in during that time. So that's been the biggest one.
Yeah, we had a little bit of sound issue in terms of your reply. What I heard you saying, and I want to ask for confirmation, is that when you're holding space in the room, you're careful about who is present in that space alongside you in distant ways. Does that reflect what you said?
Absolutely. And my work has held that. People are not allowed there when I'm in the space.
Yeah. What about for you, Tara? When you think about boundaries that you have named and maintained for yourself in this time, what's one that has been really life-changing for you?
Yeah, Chris, when you first asked that question, I had this moment of panic of, oh, I don't have good boundaries right now. How can I respond to this answer honestly and still have something to offer? And, you know, after taking a couple of deep breaths and shushing that little shame monster that Brene talks about, I realized that actually probably what's the hardest and most constant is keeping the boundary of safe distance or safer distance and caution, you know, as Eleta said, and asking others to help keep those boundaries of with me. And that's been challenging. And really that's the foundation, and everything else is kind of built on that. So how can I create a safer environment so that I can continue to be, right? So I can be healthy and be present for all that the world is asking right now.
That is so true. I'm thinking similar to what Eleta said. My boundaries are also work oriented. One of the best decisions, I think this every Monday, one of the best decisions I made at the beginning of the stay-at-home orders, at the beginning of the way all of our work has pivoted in radical ways, was that like, I am going to adjust my working schedule so that I have Monday afternoons to spend time with my family, and I'll work more hours the rest of the week because that's the time where everybody's home at the same time. And it's so important to me to make sure I prioritize my family so that I can be held and held well in the course of everything else. So I wanted to lift that up even before we went into our conversation about boundaries. So what are boundaries? I mean, we hear this word, it's told to us all the time as clergy people, as people who are attentive with our own self-care in the middle of everything, or our own self-awareness in the middle of everything. What are boundaries? So go ahead. Do you want to go first, Eleta?
What are boundaries? Boundaries. They are a lot of things. We get to try them. So in many ways they are perceived as artificial because mine may differ from yours, but they are things put in place to keep myself safe, to keep you safe, to keep others around safe. And they range from boundaries around our time to boundaries around who we're in a relationship for how long. They're flexible, they are dynamic, and they are sometimes incredibly useful. The perfect example given, I lived in a place that taken one side of the state to the other side, or to the other part of the county even. You have to go across water, and there's this bridge that's low over the water, and somebody said, if there were no guardrails, how fast would you travel down the road? And I was clear, there's boundaries, there's nothing to protect me. I would not go down it. And this was when I was railing against boundaries. And so they're useful even when you don't like them.
So I'm sorry to interrupt you. We are having some sound issues, and I don't think that it's centralized with Eleta. I think it's all of Zoom. So what we are going to do is make sure that we're speaking slowly, and pray that the technological saints will intervene in our conversation. In the meantime, for all of us as panelists, I want to let you know, and all of the people listening who use Zoom occasionally know, that you can call in and have that connected to your video by clicking the little caret next to your audio symbol, and your phone will then be the primary audio, even when it's connected to your video. So if you can bear with us, those of you who are listening live and listening in the recording, while we edit that in and get ourselves get ourselves situated, I want to make sure that you hear really clearly what we're saying, because it's so important. So I appreciate those of you who are chatting to us, that there's some issues. And in the meantime, should that not work out, if it is centralized with one of us, we can always step out and step back in again. So when I think about boundaries, I often think about the work of social psychologist Brene Brown, who talks about boundaries, and Tara referenced this earlier. Boundaries being, what are the boundaries I need to stay in my integrity and be the most generous person that I can be. And I think that is incredibly helpful to think through. So when thinking through that, Tara, how do you define boundaries, and how do you see them coming up, in your work or in your experience with clergy folk?
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, normally my context is to offer boundary training with clergy and some lay leaders. And so this context is much broader. As I said before, we're really all having to go back to kind of square one with our boundaries. And I like to think of boundaries as this space between. It's a constructed space, as Eleta has said, and I'll just re-articulate that because of the sound issues. It's one that is dynamic, that is contextual, that shifts based on the situation and around what our needs are in a moment, and attends to the other person. There have been a lot of conversations out in the media in the world today that really are at their heart boundary conversations. This idea that my rights have a beginning and an ending place, that's a boundary conversation. This idea that if I were to use my fist, there's the space between where that my body is and your body is a boundary. We see it coming up in places around how do we use our power, and how do we understand the power that we have in our roles that we play, whether that be social work or ministry or the other roles that we have in our lives. How do we use the power and privilege and the intersectionality of all of who we are in a healthy way so that we're being safe with other people? I think about that Hippocratic oath about first doing no harm. And really that means that we have to have a conversation with somebody else to know where their boundaries are in relationship to us, so that we can navigate and not traverse that space. It's a powerful and a difficult conversation to have. And I think part of what's happening right now is that we're having to have it over and over and over again as we reassess the ways that we're involved in the world right now.
And I'm also,
Okay.
I'm mindful that while Eleta is calling in, I'm mindful that boundaries are messy and they adapt. And that's been one of the challenges for me in the midst of all of this COVID stuff, is that I see that conversations with anyone I'm in contact with are conversations of informed consent. That being, I want to know, what is your level of exposure? I want to be informed so that I can make the appropriate decision in alignment with my own engagement of how I want to be choosing to put my body into spaces that may or may not contain a level of risk. And so I found that the language of boundaries that I've learned in queer community has become wildly helpful in COVID times. What's the informed consent? How am I navigating everyone's shifting boundaries as more information is coming out? And how are we having conversations about that? Every time we choose to spend time in close proximity, whatever that means, if we're outside 6 feet apart, if we're wearing masks, like what are the norms and boundaries of our social gatherings that enable us to be present with each other? And I will name that Eleta has stepped out, and we'll try coming back in again, and we're praying that the audio issues are solved.
Yeah, Chris, I think that raises some good questions and some places to go in our conversation, because the other half of what's making these times difficult, besides that it's a constant renegotiation, is that there are conflicts between what my boundaries are and what I feel as safe, and maybe what you feel as safe. And so how do we have that conversation to navigate and really honor the closest boundaries, right? The ones that are primary. And those are not conversations that I was taught how to have growing up, especially growing up as female. And I think that adds to the layering of what's challenging about boundaries is who gets to articulate them. Really, we all do, but society has some other things to say often about that. How do we articulate them, and what do we do if they're crossed or violated? How do we move through those situations in a way that keeps us from harming and keeps us from harming another? Looks like Eleta's back with us, so I'm hopeful we can re-engage.
I hope this works.
Yes.
Oh, we hear you. Welcome.
Yay. Oh, good.
Do you know, when we prepare these webinars, I will often say to everyone in preparation, we are in the same boat as so many others right now. Many of you even watching, where you're trying to do everything and you're relying on technology, and like there's so much grace. So thank you so much. So welcome back, Eleta. I would love if you can repeat your definition of boundaries, because I found so much wisdom in that.
I was just saying that they are often artificially constructed. We make them up to protect our lives, to protect the lives of those we serve, and to protect our larger community. And they, as a social worker, they have to be firm, they have to be clear, and they have to be repeated often. I work with youth and young adults. I gave the example of traveling down a bridge that goes over water in our community, the 520. And one of the counselors offered that analogy as a way to look at why boundaries are important and how to explain them in particular to young people who might want to cross or breach or not have boundaries. And he asked, if you were to drive down 520 and there were no guardrails, how would you drive? And I said that I would not, because I don't like water. And if I had to, he said, you have no choice. And I would drive slowly, 5 miles an hour down the center, making my own boundary. And so boundaries, even when we don't think we need them or want them or like them, are that important to be held often.
Yeah, Alita, that reminds me of the study that I often quote, where children and schoolyards were studied and their playing patterns. And when a boundary around a schoolyard was clearly defined, right, fences and all, kids played all the way out to the edges. And when those boundaries were not defined well, the kids played so much closer to the school building because it was safer. And so the ways that we can clearly articulate boundaries actually create safety in themselves. The articulation of those boundaries create safety, in addition to the actual guardrails themselves.
Yeah. Yes.
So we've got a whole bunch of questions that are coming in, and I want to engage some of the questions that the listeners have. And let's see, something that I think is really interesting was someone said, so from Dory Sherrill, Jesus crossed boundaries frequently, talking to women, going to the home of a tax collector, healing on the Sabbath. Isn't the real issue for us here violating boundaries rather than crossing them? I think that's a really interesting framing of it. I would offer into that a conversation of what are the unspoken boundaries and how are they held in terms of power and privilege? So, what does that mean? So I think that I want to offer each of you a chance to answer that question as well before we kind of move into how boundaries are raced or gendered.
Sarah, would you start?
Sure. Yeah, so I think that's absolutely right. And that's what we talk about too in boundary class often, that it's not the crossing, it's the violation. And again, the conversation has to happen to know where that line really is for folks. Violating is something that causes harm, and crossing is something that we do to have an intimate kind of a relationship, which ministry is, family life is, therapy is. So many arenas are intimate and involve and entering into someone else's space with permission. I think that's the loop that I would give back to that. When Chris, when you're talking about consent, when power is unequal, it's really impossible to have that full consent to a boundary crossing, and that's what makes it a violation. So that would be one thing about figuring out how to name power and privilege in a situation. In intersectional ways, that gets really mucky for many of us as far as how we see our own selves in power, and that the ability maybe or maybe an inability to see how we could be harming somebody if we don't see that we have power ourselves. But in the role of a clergy person, it's incumbent upon me to always be mindful of the power that that role in and of itself, regardless of all of the other pieces of who I am, how that plays into the interactions that I have. You know, I likened it sometimes to somebody going to see a doctor. You know, the inherent worth of the patient and the doctor, there's no different there. The value, the perspectives, you know, they're all good people. But in that situation where someone is feeling ill and someone has expertise around how to make well, there's a power difference. And so that makes informed consent difficult, impossible, actually. Yeah. Eleta, what were you going to add? I saw you nodding into this space.
There were a couple of places, power and privilege. And I cannot specifically address the theological question, but when we talked in the beginning, we talked about they are both flexible and dynamic. So that means there's going to be exceptions, and they can come at any moment. Once permission is given, that is not static. And so it changes. And some people will cross. I mean, I'm thinking about current events, and people are crossing boundaries all the time. You can't have clashes with police in the streets without crossing some kind of boundaries on both sides. So it also is situational. Again, back to artificial construction and recognizing my power and privilege as a social worker. My boundaries change, and part of my boundary keeping sometimes gets to be actual gatekeeping, which takes away somebody's power just by what I say or don't say. So I do have to be mindful of that. I wanted to touch on your doctor piece because it reminds me of a moment that I had with a doctor, a naturopath, who, when approaching me with her student behind me, held her hands up and said, "Permission to touch." I had never had that happen because that power differential is so big. But that doctor signified to me, I'm crossing a boundary, and I recognize that, and I'm going to ask permission, even though you came here knowing that that's what I was going to do. And it left me like, I burst into tears, literally. I could not believe it. So our boundaries are mutable and constructed and can be reconstructed right before our very eyes as needed.
I have found that one of the most powerful things about boundaries for me has been when someone else has modeled theirs. You know, when I witness someone else modeling things like, saying what their boundary is, I receive that as such a gift.
Yes.
Because I think it takes a lot of courage to state your own boundaries, particularly in a conflict avoidant society and culture. And that's not all cultures, let me be clear. But in places where there's conflict avoidance, people are afraid to say their boundaries because their boundaries can be perceived as something that is harming someone else, when that's not what's, in some boundaries are control over, my boundaries are control over me. I can say what my boundaries are and be aware of that, but I cannot dictate someone else's behavior. So when someone tells me what their boundaries are, it's such a gift because now I can adjust my behavior to demonstrate that respect for those boundaries. I'm going to bring in a question that someone asked about how, with awareness that sometimes that modeled language is what's really, really helpful. So Emily, we have a question from Emily about how can we express boundaries like audio, video in Zoom meetings? Like a right to privacy in our homes, our families, like, for example, audio only, or a need for a visual connection in these isolated times. And I'm curious what thoughts the two of you have about that.
Well, again, situational. I'm getting ready to do something that I'm going to ask people some questions that are going to be challenging to answer as themselves. So somewhere between 50 and 200 people are going to be asked by a slide to change their name to the same name in order that they may answer the question in chat, because it will be used later as anonymously as possible. So that's one way that I'm trying to allow people both to have voice and disagreement without being targeted later on the basis of being exposed and taped. In my home, I only do my Zoom meetings in two places pretty much. And they offer just a slice, but a very small slice of what's in my life, because I don't want my whole life to be a part of everybody else's life.
What a great boundary.
Privacy. So that's the things I can think of.
Yeah, I think being really clear about what we are asking of people and and inviting them to be really clear about what they can offer when we're in the leadership role online. I had a long day on Zoom, and at one point I just said, I need to not be seen. I can't keep my game face on any longer, and I'm feeling tired, and that's okay. That's a human thing, and it's also okay for me to shut off the video for a bit and just listen to the next part of this conversation. And I think we could practice some permission giving around that, to say to one another, it's okay. We would love to see your face, and we recognize that that may not be something that you can do right now, or you can do for a whole hour, or whatever it is. So how can we be together in some ways that honor, again, that space between me and my hopes or needs and your needs and hopes? I think that would be a lovely thing for us to begin to think really concretely about. What parts do we need to be present in video and in name, and at what parts can we be present in name only, or even anonymously, as Eleta had said. I think there's some good modeling there.
Yeah, I'm thinking about how boundaries, they're static. They can be kind of messy, because when my boundaries and your boundaries are in dissonance, we're going to get to a place where the conversation, in order to be in relationship, we have to have conversation about it. And there has to be, in order to be in a relationship that respects the humanity of everyone involved, there's a conversation to be had. That's a way to say that with more intention. And I'm thinking about how a lot of times, boundaries are work to have and to hold. And if you have a boundary that's stated and has constant pushback on that boundary, there's an emotional cost to holding that boundary. And how relevant that is today, when we're having all sorts of conversations about whose work is it to do the education about anti-racism, whose work is it to be in these conversations and to host them. And if people are putting up boundaries like, this is not my work, y'all, like, I'm not going to do this, and those boundaries are constantly pushing on them, there's a cost to that for a lot of people. So I want to say that explicitly too, as a boundary that can and must be respected in these conversations. And I'm curious as to how that resonates, or how you would push on that with your own boundaries in conversations and experiences.
These have been interesting times. These have been very interesting times, and I do the work. I do anti-oppression through my business, my side hustle is literally doing training on anti-oppression. Means I'm working with, most often, people who are not targeted by the oppression. So, setting up clear boundaries of who we are as human beings. Okay. Slowing down and thank you. So setting up boundaries, talking about who we are as human beings, and that I protect that connection and that piece of levelness. The place where it gets challenging is when I'm a presenter and then not the presenter, and people still want to carry on the conversation, it's really back to clear boundaries. In this place, at this time, this is what we are about. When this is over, that is over. And so for me, setting that clear boundary, and especially talking about race, talking about being queer, talking about being a single parent, anything, that space time I want to be sacred for me, and I want it to be sacred for the person I'm dealing with. So I can say that.
I really appreciate how you say that boundaries are time bound, and that's the kind of thing you can say at the start of something like a teaching session about racial justice and equity. And I heard you say that you do that kind of consulting work on the side, and some of that is what happens when you have the in this time, here is how we will be interacting together, and at the end of this time, at the end of this contract, because that's paid work, then it is not that the boundaries are different.
Right.
And so part of what I'm repeating is to make sure that folks caught it through some of the audio issues. So I appreciate your grace as I try and succinctly recap what you have said so intentionally.
Yeah, and I think one thing that's worked for me is to be able to name the layers of those boundaries. I had a request from some friends about getting together, right? A simple request, but I didn't want to say no. It was really hard because I miss my friends. I miss that contact. And so it took me a little bit to step back and to say, okay, why is this hard? And what are the boundaries that I'm trying to navigate? And I had to realize that actually it was my personal comfort or discomfort about being together with somebody else. It was my family's health and risk that I needed to take into consideration. It was the structure of the event itself or the gathering itself. It was my friends' relationships and all that they brought into this conversation. And once I was able to name the layers of the boundaries, it became easier to understand and give myself a little bit of grace to say, oh, this is why this is so hard, because it's not just me needing to say yes or no, it's the layers of these boundary conversations that are entering into this. And that was helpful.
So I'm going to bring in another question from the chat, and this might be for you, Tara, is what are your suggestions for pastors to exercise their boundaries even during this time when we are called to step up?
Yeah, one of the things I kept hearing early on was that because this felt and was crisis, that our boundaries relaxed, right? We got into these ways of responding in the moment, whether it was during time when we would normally be working or not. We were just available because that seemed to be the way to meet the need, was to be as present and available through a screen, through a text, however we could be. And after a while, it became clear that those boundaries were no longer serving or healthy or appropriate. And so then we had to try and begin to have some conversations to say, you know what? My working hours are thus and so. I'm available on these days at these times. Certainly if there's an emergency and we can define what an emergency is, I can be present to you. But for the regular kind of everyday stuff, which again is heightened right now, but these are the places where I'm going to be available, and these are the best ways to reach me. I've found it really helpful in my own life to remember that I have control over how and when I respond. That even though something comes in one format, if that's not how I feel comfortable responding back, I can respond in the way that I feel safe and good about responding. And if I need to take some time to think about that, I can articulate, I will get back to you soon, or let me have a conversation and think about that, or some ways to give myself some time and space to respond in a way that begins to set a different kind of a boundary in those situations. I want to just say it's really hard. And especially when we've gotten into one pattern for a few weeks or several weeks and now want to shift that pattern, it's challenging. what I keep hearing from parishioners is the importance of knowing when they're going to see their minister again, right? So knowing when the next time is that we're going to be together, however it is that we're together, knowing when the next communication is going to come, so that we can ease some of that anxiety about being isolated or alone. So I hope those are some things that help navigate.
Yeah, I mean, it leads into this wondering I have about when and how we are setting boundaries across different layers of relationship, power, and privilege. How is it that the expectation of the people that you're interacting with play in to what information in those boundaries that you're setting are important to clarify at the beginning? I mean, I'm thinking for you, Eleta, when you're in conversation with clients, the expectation is, you know, we're going to be here for 50 minutes or whatever, and like there's a defined time and a defined relationship. And for clergy, similarly, with our parishioners, there's a defined relationship present where the expectations, when unspoken, become boundaries that we stumble into. And often, you know, like it's church, when when there are unspoken boundaries and they get violated, it's a mess. Like, so those expectations, those boundaries, and how we speak them in such a, how we communicate them in such a way that we are attentive to the often unspoken expectations upon us because of all of these overlapping roles and responsibilities. So yeah. Want to add into that, Eleta? I see you nodding.
Yeah. The biggest, I think you've both spoken well to it. There are so many ways, both consciously and unconsciously. Okay.
It's okay. It's technology. Well, you maybe if you step back out and come back in again, that fixed it in a major way. And while you are doing that, I'm going to ask Tara another pastoral boundary question coming in from the people who are watching, which is someone says, one of the hardest boundaries I found as a pastor is the boundary of time and availability, especially with social media. Parishioners and fellow pastors expect pastors to be on all the time. So what resources can pastors use with lay leaders to discuss setting realistic expectations and boundaries around time and availability?
Excellent question. Let's see. So this is going to take some internal work before we can do the external work, right? So this is going to mean that we stand in our grounded, truest, most honest self about what we need in order to survive these times, ideally thrive, but foundationally, right? What is it that we need, our families need, you know, our communities need? What is the essential need there? And then out of that, we can talk about what we can give to others. That's the first part of this work, is to do it internally first. And then the communication hopefully will come with the places in your setting that help you articulate all kinds of things to the congregation. You know, your pastoral relations committee, your personnel committee, your board. You're having these conversations with church leaders around what it is that makes sense as far as what the church and what you as a pastor will provide. And so then you're not holding that boundary just alone, you're holding it in community with those that have as leaders that they're going to help you with that conversation and help the congregation with that conversation. I think part of that, what gets mixed up in these boundary conversations, are needs and wants, our preferences and essentials. And so teasing that part apart, I would love to be together with folks. I don't, having some sharing meal around the table, that would be my love. I don't need that, right? I don't need that to survive. I need to be healthy. I need to be whole. I need to be grounded. That's what I need. I would love to have those other things too. And so to help, again, the congregation begin to say, this is really sad and hard that we can't have what we want. We can't have what our heart desires as a way to be together. and I'm going to model tending to what my body and soul spirit needs. And I'm going to invite you to do that too. And then together we'll have a conversation about how we can attend to the spiritual and relational hopes for our community.
I love that in that it's starting with the self. What is it that I need? And then moving out to the, how is that in conversation with others? And how is that in conversation with community? And I think that's a good lead into another question that came in from folks on here, which is about how can we express our own boundaries about when it comes to wearing masks? I mean, this is a really live question right now, is that, for example, when someone is not wearing a mask and this makes you uncomfortable, how do you go about saying this upsets you without it upsetting the other person? So that's a catch-22 there. Eleta, I'm going to pass this one to you to start, and then we'll go around.
I have run into that. And yes. And I respect first, those people have set some kind of boundary that's different than mine. And their not wearing a mask is a boundary. They have decided differently. So I recognize that first. And will say that. I respect your right, absolutely, to have the no mask. That's the boundary you've set for yourself. I try to ask a question and talk about the reason why I wear a mask, and who I might be affecting by not wearing a mask. As a social worker, working with people who have often no insurance, and other basic things that I take for granted, I ask people to wear a mask just so that we can keep our participants in our program healthy. They don't have the same access we do. In this time of COVID, I have run into people who have been violently opposed to a mask. I ask, in our space together, would you either be willing to do a mask, or would you be okay with us not meeting at this time? Like, I want people to have the range of choices. And I will say mine would be, and I have extra masks I will share for this time. If that's not workable for you, then I need to exit myself. And I do it with knowing that I still hold out respect and love for that person, but not right now. People have met that well so far.
Yeah, I think what I heard too in that is that, gosh, I would really like to have that kind of wizardry power, right? So that my perspective somehow could prevail. But that in itself is a boundary violation, thinking that that is really my role, is to have that kind of power for someone else. And so I really appreciate, Eleta, what you said about giving options, and again, getting really clear about this is where my line is, and this is what I need for me and my family. And I've gotten to a place where at first it seems like I was having that conversation internally every 15 minutes or so. Every time I would read a new news article or get some more information, I'd have to go back through and say, okay, what are my choices here? And I've gotten to a place where I'm like, nope, you know what? Maybe once a week, I'm going to have this recheck with myself and my spouse and just say, okay, are we still good about the boundaries that we're keeping around mask wearing, around social, or not social, but physical distancing while keeping socially connected? So that I'm not having that continually, but just having some parameters on when I have that conversation.
I often go back to the definition of boundaries as what's okay and what's not okay. And I think sometimes for me in that conversation, I can say something like, it's not okay for me to hang out if you don't have a mask on. Like, I love you. I want to see you. Again, to what Tara was saying, I want for this to be our reality. And in the absence of that reality, it's not okay. And moving from there. Like one of the things we were saying earlier is that it takes a lot of work to hold up boundaries. And I also, I'm often wondering about whose work is it? It is our work. And at the same time, if we are communicating, this is my boundary over and over and over again, and experiencing from the same person violation of said boundary every single time that we're spending time together, then there's for me, that would indicate that there needs to be some relational assessment work that happens in one way or another, whether that's a personal relationship, a professional relationship, a pastoral relationship, or whatever that relationship is. If there is an inability that I have not consented to being in a relationship, sometimes I feel like the power differentiation there is a little bit different. What I mean by that is that sometimes we are working with people intentionally where we know that the boundaries we have are difficult in terms of cognitive awareness for them to understand. That's an informed consent decision for me to be in that relationship. But in the absence of that, what happens when the work of holding boundaries is consistent and they're violated over and over by the same folk? Like, what do you do in that sense, in that time?
Well, I think my work has been to give myself permission. Oh, not.
I know. We'll start with Tara and then come back to you, okay?
In the BC, right, in the before COVID era, the conversations we were having with clergy and with faith communities were really around how to articulate those boundaries in such a way that there was some consequence if the boundaries were repeatedly violated. And congregations have begun to create behavioral covenants that say these are the ways that we're going to be together, and if we can't be together in these ways, then we're going to invite you to find another place to be. Yes, there's some reference in a Sure Foundation to these resources.
I'm picking this up and saying something, so you see me holding said resource, which is available in UCC resources, and it talks about behavioral covenants, which is one of my favorite ways of making communal boundaries that all of you in your community agree to. Is not necessarily not the why, but how are we going to be in relationship with one another?
Right.
And I think that's a glorious thing to be in conversation about.
Yes. Yeah, hopefully you're in conversation together, so it's not the one person and the whole community, right? That there's leadership and that's a shared conversation about what's safe for everyone involved. These boundary conversations in the family, you may not have that that luxury of a community to stand together and have a conversation. But I think it's important to recognize that my my needs and my desire and actual need to feel safe is really important. It's essential, and so I get to protect that boundary.
But I think it's also really important to say that, especially as we're having conversations about racial justice and equity, safety is an issue that particularly white women will decide is the boundary. And safety is not the same thing as discomfort. So I just want to say that part aloud as all of you are in conversation about your, even thinking through your own boundaries. Where are they? Is that to do the self-assessment of, is this boundary coming from a place of potential discomfort and my internalized conflict avoidance, or is it coming from a real place of safety, and what does that mean?
Yeah, thank you. I had played around with some other ways instead of saying safety, and I didn't look at my notes, but something about tending, right? Safe tending and safe keeping and increased safe spaces, brave spaces. I think, Chris, you've introduced me to that understanding of how we can create spaces.
And I learned that from Mickey Scott Bay Jones.
Yes. I knew it wasn't yours, but yeah. I think that's a good reminder to us too about that internal work around what it is what safe means to us and why. Where did that come from?
Eleta, to you about how to in the circumstance where your boundary is verbalized and communicated in one way or another, and the relationship that is present where that violates consistently. What do you do?
I name it when and where possible, and I often literally set that time. So I say,
So as her audio is fixing, and with abundant grace, Tara, I'm curious if you have any closing words that you want to add about boundaries, while Eleta steps off and comes back in again, because that's been working.
Yeah. Often these conversations about boundaries are kind of lowest common denominator conversations, and I would really hope that we can have them in a higher plane, in an ideal, that they're about creating sanctuary, about creating that brave space. They're about healing and hope, and creating just a little bit of cushion for us to do our work and to live and thrive in, and that they are offered to us as a way of being respectful and caring and loving toward one another. And that's the framework that I would hope that we could end on, is this invitation to imagine that level of care around boundaries. Certainly respecting the safe needs, or the needs to do no harm, but really elevating that conversation to how could they be for us a way that brings us closer to the kingdom of God.
Thank you so much. Any closing words from you, Eleta, either in the window, or if you want to put them in the chat to all panelists and attendees, I will read them aloud, so that there is equal access to that information, whether in here live or in the recording thereafter. When I'm thinking about closing words on boundaries, what I would say is that the articulation that I have of my own boundaries comes from so much practice. It is very difficult. It was very difficult at the start for me to advocate for myself and for what I needed to be a healthy, whole, grounded individual in the world, particularly because that kind of boundary setting is often seen as the beginning of conflict, especially when they are coming from people with less privilege, like people who are not cis white men. Those boundaries are often named and respected pretty often, not always, hear me, respected with more acknowledgement than the further from a level of privilege that one is. So when thinking through how to have and hold boundaries, it's the practice and the grace of community to recognize how power and how power functions within all boundaries, even when it's unacknowledged power, and especially when it's unacknowledged power. Is so important. And I will say that the place where I've been able to practice and learn those boundaries so much has been, for me, I just want to give honor and honor to the queer community, in a way that, to be in that kind of community where it's deeply intersectional, and how to live within the contexts of people who have chosen to be in community, especially when relationships end or get messy and we choose to continue to do it. That's where I get a lot of my learning from, and with a lot of respect for that. So thank you. And then the final words I will lift up from Eleta are: all of us have boundaries, many of which are formed early, and we are sometimes even unaware of having them. Those boundaries get to be respected, and we also get to hold ourselves responsible for addressing them after we become aware. True. So, and she says, I try to remember that our varied life experiences will make for challenges on the way. Also very true. We are, thank you. I also have that memory of, what is it that has come into being as a result to get you to where you are, and how can I hold you in the most respect and with the most grace I have access to in conversation with all of those boundaries. So a couple of things as we are closing. The first is that I want to say thank you to Tara and to Eleta for coming and for saying yes to bringing your wisdom in one way or another, whether it is through the chat and through these conversations or through the audio. Thank you so much for being here. This is an essential conversation for the church and for the world. And I want to say thank you too to I always want to remember. So Jennifer White is in the background. All of you do not often see her, but she's making this tech happen with a lot of grace and with a lot of flexibility. So thanks to Jennifer White too. And finally, for those of you listening, if this has mattered to you, if this is the kind of conversation that has enabled you to live more fully in your life, in your congregation, in your community, you can help support the United Church of Christ to have these conversations by texting UCC to 41444, and that will show up on the final slide as well, to make a donation to the annual fund, which helps us to continue to do this kind of work so that we are present alongside you in the co-creation of a just world. So thank you for that. I want to let you know that on Thursday of this week, we will be having a webinar called Queer the Church, which is a conversation between me, where my academic work has focused in that way. So it's exciting to bring that in here, and Reverend Darrell Goodwin, who will be present with us on Thursday at this time as well. So join us, be blessed, and I'm going to ask the Reverend Tara Barber to pray us into the rest of our evening. Thank you so much, and we will see you on Thursday.
Ever-present God, thank you for the gift of this day, for the ways that you call us and surround us and empower us and love us and invite us to hold those bounds that create for safety, that create for relationship, that create for the work that you have envisioned for us. Be with us as we go through our day. It's still noontime on the West Coast, and so we celebrate together the ways that we are about your work. In the strong name of Jesus and in your many names we pray. Amen.